In 1963, a man with a Russian accent and a Chinese birthplace walked into a bank in Sydney and asked for money to build apartments. The loan officer looked at him the way you look at someone who has fundamentally misunderstood the country they are living in. Australians did not live in apartments. Australians lived in houses. Detached houses with backyards and Hills hoist clotheslines and Holden sedans parked on driveways that led to front lawns no one fenced. The quarter-acre block was not a housing preference. It was a national creed. And this man, this outsider with no connections, no local roots, no cultural standing whatsoever, wanted to stack people on top of each other in concrete towers, in a city that stretched to the horizon in every direction with nothing taller than a chimney. The bank said no. He found another bank. They also said no. He kept going. And across the next 6 decades, Harry Triguboff, born stateless in Manchuria, educated in England, ignored in Australia, built more than 75,000 apartments through a single private company he owns entirely by himself, with no outside shareholders, no board of directors, no public listing, and no intention of ever selling a single building he did not have to sell. By the time Forbes and the Australian financial press tried to calculate what he was worth, the number kept moving. 10 billion, 15, 20, somewhere north of that in Australian dollars during a good year, because no one, possibly including Triguboff himself, could pin a firm value on a private empire made of concrete and rental income and land that had been compounding in value for half a century. You have almost certainly never heard of him. And that fact alone tells you something about how wealth actually works when it is not performed for cameras. Start in Dalian, 1933. The city was called Daren then, a port on the coast of Manchuria in northeastern China, and it was not quite Chinese, not quite Japanese, not quite Russian, not quite anything. Japan had occupied Manchuria 2 years earlier and would hold it until 1945. The streets were wide, planned by Japanese urban engineers, and lined with Russian-style buildings alongside Japanese colonial structures. In winter, the harbor froze. In summer, the light came flat off the Yellow Sea. The Triguboff family were Russian Jews, part of a substantial Jewish community that had settled across Manchuria in waves after fleeing the pogroms and upheavals of the Russian Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Harry's father, Moshe, was a textile merchant, moderately successful, comfortable enough by the standards of the foreign community, but legally nowhere. The family held no passport of any country. The Soviet Union did not recognize them. China did not grant them citizenship. They existed in the bureaucratic void that was the common condition of diaspora Jews in that era, present but not belonging, prosperous but not protected. Harry Triguboff was born into that void on March 3, 1933. A child who was, by the paperwork that governs the world, from no place at all. Think about what that does to a person. Not the trauma narrative, that comes cheap. Think about what it does to your sense of how things are supposed to work. You grow up watching your father run a business in a city controlled by an occupying army, in a community that could be expelled at any moment, in a country that does not consider you its citizen. You learn very early that the way things are is not the way things have to be. You learn that consensus is local, that what one country considers impossible, another considers obvious. That attachment to the way things have always been done is a luxury available only to people who have always been somewhere. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Chinese Civil War made Manchuria's foreign communities increasingly unwelcome. The communist victory in 1949 finished it. The Triguboff family left China around 1947, when Harry was approximately 14. The precise route they took varies across different interviews he has given over the decades. Israel, Switzerland, other stops have been mentioned at different times. What is certain is that Harry ended up at the University of Leeds in England, studying textile sciences, a choice shaped by his father's trade. And that sometime in the late 1950s, he arrived in Sydney, Australia, to work in the textile business his father had re-established there. He found textiles uninspiring. What he found inspiring was the thing that was missing. Sydney, in the early 1960s, was among the most suburbanized cities on Earth. You could drive for an hour in any direction and see nothing but single-story houses. Fibro-cement walls, brick veneer, corrugated iron roofs, the same house repeated with minor variations across thousands of streets. The cultural assumption embedded in every planning regulation, every bank lending policy, every conversation at every barbecue in every backyard was that this was how Australians lived and would always live. Apartments were for European migrants who didn't know any better, or for poor people packed into old inner-city terrace subdivisions. The idea that a middle-class Australian family would choose to live in a purpose-built tower was not just unconventional. It was a kind of heresy. Triguboff, who had grown up in a dense Chinese port city and lived in England and traveled through Asia, looked at this landscape and saw something the locals could not see because they were standing inside it. He saw a city running out of land near its center. He saw population growing. He saw that the mathematics of sprawl, the cost of roads, pipes, power lines, commute times, would eventually break. And he saw that density was not a cultural failure. It was the future. He started Meriton in the early 1960s. The name came from merit. He said he wanted the company to reflect a meritocratic approach, which, given that he was a stateless immigrant in a country that still ran partly on inherited social networks, was either naive or defiant. Probably both. His first project was a small block of flats in Granville, a working-class suburb in Western Sydney. 8 units. Face brick, 3 stories, aluminum balcony railings, flat roof. Nothing glamorous. He taught himself construction management the only way that actually works, by being on the site every day, watching what happened, learning what went wrong, understanding what concrete does when it cures, and what steel does when it rusts, and what a plumber charges when he knows the developer is desperate. That modest walk-up in Granville is the seed from which everything else grew. But the seed is not the story. The soil is. Here is what made Triguboff different from every other developer who ever poured a foundation, and what has made his wealth so difficult for outsiders to understand. Most developers build and sell. They buy land, design a building, pre-sell apartments, off the plan to fund construction, complete the project, settle the sales, take their profit margin, typically 15 to 25%, and recycle the capital into the next project. It is a manufacturing business. Inventory turns, margin per unit, speed of capital deployment. The developer who does this well gets rich. The developer who does this brilliantly gets very rich. Triguboff did something else. He built and he kept the buildings. Not all of them. Meriton does sell apartments, particularly off the plan to fund construction. The popular version of the story, that he has never sold a single unit, is an oversimplification. But the core truth is real. Meriton retains a far larger proportion of its completed buildings than any comparable developer, operating them as rental properties and serviced apartments through its own management arm, Meriton Suites, which became one of the largest serviced apartment and hotel networks in Australia. All developed internally, never acquired. The mathematics of this are what no one who has not sat with a compound interest table can quite believe. Take a building completed in Sydney's eastern suburbs in 1975. Construction cost in period dollars, perhaps 2 or 3 million. That building, sitting on its original land, maintained and rented for 5 decades, is now worth somewhere between $80 and $150 million in current value. And it has been generating rental income every single month for 50 years, income that funded the construction of the next building, which also was not sold, which also appreciated, which also generated income. Multiply this across hundreds of completed buildings, across decades of Sydney property appreciation driven by population growth, restrictive planning, credit expansion, and the simple geographical fact that Sydney is hemmed between ocean and mountains with limited room to spread. Each building becomes a machine that funds the next machine. The portfolio grows not by selling at a profit, but by never selling at all. This is what Triguboff meant when he told the Australian Financial Review, in words paraphrased from several interviews. Why would I sell a building that will be worth more next year? And the year after that? Selling is for people who need the money. I don't need the money. I need the buildings. You can hear in that statement something that sounds like greed. But listen again, it is not greed. It is a specific kind of logic. The logic of someone who understood, perhaps because he had seen wealth destroyed and rebuilt across continents, that the only asset that matters is the one you do not let go of. There is a genuine debate among Australian urban economists about what Triguboff's 6 decades of building have actually done to Sydney. One school argues that large-scale private apartment construction enabled the city's population growth without adequate infrastructure planning, that Meriton and developers like it normalized high-density living while governments failed to invest in the transport, schools, and public spaces that density requires, contributing to a housing affordability crisis that punishes the very middle-class families Triguboff claims to house. The other school argues the opposite, that without Meriton's relentless output, sometimes approaching 10% of all new apartments completed in Sydney in a given year, the city's housing shortage would be dramatically worse and prices dramatically higher. Neither side has definitively won. The truth is probably that both are partially right, which is the kind of answer that satisfies no one and describes most complex realities. What is not debatable is the scale. Meriton claims to have constructed over 75,000 apartments since inception. Some sources put the number above 80,000. The figure is company-sourced, not independently audited, but given documented annual output of 2,000 to 3,000 apartments sustained over decades, the cumulative total is plausible. No individual private developer anywhere in the world has a documented record of producing a comparable number of residential units. The closest comparisons are government housing agencies, Singapore's Housing Development Board, Hong Kong's Housing Authority, but those are state programs, not a single man's private company. One man, no partners, no shareholders, no board. If you have spent time in the American business world, where even mid-sized companies have advisory boards and institutional investors and quarterly earnings calls, this is almost impossible to process. Meriton, at a scale that would place it among major publicly traded real estate investment trusts, operates as a private fiefdom. Triguboff can approve a $200 million land acquisition in a single meeting because there is no one to ask. No committee, no shareholder vote, no quarterly guidance to manage. His publicly listed competitors navigate layers of corporate governance that add weeks to every decision. He picks up the phone. He has stated in various interviews that this speed is his competitive advantage. And he may be right. But it is also his vulnerability, because the same structure that allows instant decisions also means there is no external check on a bad one. The empire depends entirely on the judgment of one man. It always has. And that man, here is the detail that stays with you, still visits construction sites multiple times a week. Into his late 80s, into his 90s. He arrives in simple clothes, open collar, no tie, and walks through active building sites among hard hats and concrete pumps and tower cranes. And he reportedly knows the names of individual crane operators on his projects. He can tell, he has said, whether work is behind schedule just by looking at the site. If you have ever wondered what obsession looks like when it compounds over 60 years, it looks like a 90-year-old man standing on a construction site in Western Sydney at 7 in the morning, squinting at rebar. The contradictions should be named, because they are part of the man, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. In 2018, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the country's consumer protection authority, took enforcement action against Meriton service departments for systematically manipulating TripAdvisor reviews. The method was almost comically petty for a company of this scale. Meriton's staff had been providing false email addresses for dissatisfied guests so that TripAdvisor's automated review invitations would never reach them. Only happy guests received invitations. The company was fined $3 million, a rounding error against Triguboff's net worth, but a public humiliation that revealed something about the operational culture of the company. A billionaire's empire, fiddling with email addresses to suppress bad reviews. It is the kind of detail that makes you recalibrate your image of the whole enterprise. Consumer complaints about build quality in some Meriton developments are documented and ongoing. Defects in apartment construction are an industry-wide problem in Australia. Not unique to Meriton, but Meriton's sheer volume produces a higher absolute number of complaints. The question of whether the hold model actually incentivizes quality, since the company bears its own maintenance costs, or whether the relentless emphasis on volume inevitably degrades construction standards, is not settled. The evidence is genuinely mixed, and Triguboff himself has made politically controversial statements over the years about immigration, urban planning restrictions, and government regulation. Statements that position him as an advocate for dramatically increased housing supply and reduced planning controls, which makes him simultaneously an ally and an antagonist, depending on where you stand in Australia's permanent argument about how its cities should grow. He is not a universally admired figure in his own country. He is a consequential one. Here is the question that lingers, and it is the question the business schools have not properly asked. Is the Meriton model, build, hold, compound, never sell, replicable? Or is it the product of one man's particular psychology meeting one city's particular conditions at one moment in economic history that will never recur? The skeptics say Triguboff's fortune is essentially a leveraged bet on Sydney residential property during a 40-year appreciation cycle driven by population growth, Chinese capital inflows, restrictive zoning, and cheap credit. That the model would have destroyed him in a flat market. That he was not a genius, but a man who held one asset class in one city during the greatest property boom in that city's history. The defenders say the model's genius is precisely that it eliminates the need to time markets. By never selling, you never crystallize a loss. You ride through downturns because you have rental income. You wait. And in major global cities, over any sufficiently long holding period, property has historically rewarded patience with returns that dwarf what selling and recycling could have produced. Both arguments are plausible. Neither can be conclusively tested because there is only one Meriton, and you cannot rerun the experiment in different conditions. What you can say is this: Triguboff's family wealth was real, but modest when they arrived in Australia. His father was a merchant, not a mogul. The starting advantages were genuine and should not be erased, but they were trivially small relative to the outcome. The scale of what he built with them is so disproportionate that the origin story, while not the rags-to-riches myth of popular imagination, remains extraordinary by any honest measure. He has 2 daughters. The succession plan for Meriton is not publicly documented, which is perhaps the most consequential gap in the entire story. A private empire worth somewhere between $10 and $25 billion, depending on who is counting and what the market is doing, built by one man over 6 decades, with no clear public accounting of what happens when that man is no longer walking the sites. He told the Australian Financial Review something once that contained more self-knowledge than most billionaires ever display. "They tell me I'm worth a certain number of billions," he said, in paraphrase. "But I can't spend it. It's buildings. I don't want to sell the buildings. The buildings are the business." A man worth more than most countries' housing budgets, who cannot write a check for $1 billion without dismantling the machine that made him, whose wealth is measured not in liquidity, but in concrete and plumbing and elevator shafts and rental agreements and keys, thousands upon thousands of keys, in cabinets in management offices across Sydney and Brisbane and the Gold Coast, each one opening a door to a home that someone lives in, because a stateless boy from a frozen Chinese port city looked at the flattest, most suburban country on earth and saw verticality. If you have ever driven through Sydney and noticed the apartment towers catching late light along the harbour, spreading west across the suburban plain, rising in clusters around train stations and highway interchanges, those are not anonymous developments by faceless corporations. A remarkable number of them were built by one man's company, one decision-maker, one unbroken thread of conviction running from a modest walk-up in Granville in the early 1960s to a skyline that would be unrecognizable to the bank manager who said no. Have you encountered Triguboff's work? Stayed in a Meriton apartment? Lived in one? Walked past one of his buildings without knowing whose it was? Tell us what you noticed. Tell us what you didn't. Harry Triguboff is past 90 now. He is still building. Not because the money requires it. The money has been beyond requirement for decades. Not because the empire needs him, though it may, in ways the succession gap makes difficult to assess. He is still building because building is what he does. It is the verb that has organized his entire adult life. He has done it in the same city, through the same company, with the same model for more than 60 years. The apartments will outlast him. The rental income will keep arriving. The land beneath the towers will keep appreciating, or it won't. And either way, the buildings will stand there, housing people, collecting rain, reflecting whatever light Sydney throws at them on a given morning. He never became famous outside Australia. He never went public. He never wrote a bestseller, or gave a TED Talk, or built a spaceship. He just kept building apartments and refusing to sell them in a country that spent decades telling him no one wanted them. Until the skyline itself was his answer. One man. No partners. 75,000 doors. The keys are still in the cabin.